I've seen a few comments and even some videos by other content creators lately expressing reservations or outright hostility towards this idea of negotiating with biblical texts as part of our interpretive process. And so I wanted to make a video to hopefully help alleviate some of that anxiety by giving what I think will be a non-controversial example of how virtually everybody negotiates with a particular verse in the Bible, so that it seems less scary when we talk about doing it in other places. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 16, Paul says to rejoice always. Now, this is about as simple as a verse gets. There are no complicated contextual issues or linguistic issues here. This isn't like a culturally bound moral prescription that has a bunch of weird implications to it that can only be done in a particular time in a particular place. It doesn't have any of those other problems that sometimes get in the way when we're thinking about trying to apply sort of biblical morality to our situation today. This one's pretty cut and dry, pretty straightforward. I imagine that a lot of people, upon reading this, will think to themselves, that ought to be part of my sort of Christian practice today. I want to try to rejoice always. And yet, as soon as we sit down to actually think about what that might look like, we encounter some tensions. There are a number of problems that we need to sort of figure out some way to get past in order to actually have this as a morally prescriptive principle in our lives. Several different types of problems, in fact. There are problems related to personal experience. For example, our own experience of emotions in life tells us that we simply won't have the emotional energy necessary to rejoice always. You're simply not always in the mood to rejoice. And so if you're trying to force yourself to rejoice always, there are going to be occasions in which that rejoicing is quite inauthentic. And that's a problem for a bunch of reasons. You don't want to end up in a situation where you're constantly faking a particular emotion. That's going to have like long-term negative mental health consequences when you're insincere all the time. And there are also times in our lives where it seems appropriate to have other feelings, right? Genuine negative feelings of grief or sadness or mourning. It seems like there are times when it is more appropriate to feel those things than trying to rejoice. And trying to rejoice at the same time that you feel these other negative emotions might just be impossible to do. So there's some tension between reading this in a morally prescriptive way and our basic experience of our own emotional life. There's also some tension here between this verse or reading this verse in a morally prescriptive way and other verses in the Bible. So, for example, in Ecclesiastes 3, we hear that there's a time for joy, for sure, but there's also a time for weeping and for mourning and for some other rather terrible things, death and war, that would occasion genuine negative emotion. And if there are a time for all these things, then it seems like that we can't be rejoicing all the time. You might look at the example of Jesus, who mourns the death of his beloved friend Lazarus in John chapter 11. And if you combine this with like the idea in John chapter 13 that we ought to love as Jesus loves, then perhaps we ought to mirror Jesus' emotional life in some way. So perhaps we should mourn when our beloved friends pass away as well. In which case, at least on that occasion, we're not rejoicing. So there's some tension between that cluster of verses and this idea of rejoicing always. Or you could take like Paul's admonition in Philippians that we ought to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Or how are we going to be working out our own salvation with fear and trembling while simultaneously rejoicing? It seems like there's some tension there between those things. So there's some very real tension between reading this verse, rejoice always, in a morally prescriptive way, in a simple, literal, morally prescriptive way, with not only our own personal experience, but also with these other verses in the Bible. So the question is, what are we supposed to do? And the answer is, we negotiate. We negotiate in our interpretation of this passage. We literally trade away some things in order to get other things. Namely, here, we trade away the possibility of reading this one verse in a simple, literal, and absolute sort of way, in exchange for what we get when we trade, in exchange for being able to be faithful to our own personal experience and to these other verses in the Bible. So as we trade away the ability to read this in a literal, simple, and sort of absolute way, what that's going to mean is that we're going to impose some sort of qualification on it. We're going to say, rejoice always, yeah, but what that really means is that we're going to rejoice as much as possible. We're going to try and make it a virtue of ours that in every circumstance where we can find the time, we're going to try to find something to rejoice about that circumstance. Now, that's not identical to what the verse says. Nobody reading that verse would say it means rejoice as much as possible whenever you have the time and energy to do so in whatever way you find the time. It doesn't say that, obviously. It says rejoice always. But we are going to impose this qualification on it. In exchange for imposing that qualification on it, we get the ability to be more faithful to our own personal experience, which we know we can't rejoice always. We don't have the emotional energy for it. And we know we ought not to rejoice always because there are times when we need to be generally grieving or sad or something like that. It also allows us to be more faithful to these other passages in the Bible. There's a time for war and grief and weeping and tears and all that kind of stuff. And, on certain occasions, we need to be able to mourn the death of friends or other significant failures in life. So we get to be more faithful to our personal experience and to these other verses in the Bible in exchange for imposing a frankly non-biblical qualification on this one verse. Now, I don't think this will be particularly controversial because we all do this, right? Everybody who has read this verse and doesn't go around like a madman rejoicing always has undertaken this process. Everybody has negotiated with this verse in a similar sort of way. Now, they've probably done it unconsciously, so they're not really aware of the fact that they have done it, but you just don't walk around seeing people rejoicing always, Christian or otherwise. And so they must have done something in order to get out of a simple, literal, and absolute reading of this. Another important thing to note here is that the Bible isn't the thing that's telling us how to negotiate with this verse. The Bible is indifferent. The Bible itself is indifferent to whether or not we read this in a simple, literal, and absolute way, or we find some way to qualify it to be more faithful to our experience into these other verses. The Bible itself can't arbitrate that issue. It can provide sort of the raw material in the form of verses and things like that we can use to help us think through what a qualification might look like. But at the end of the day, it's not going to tell us whether or not we did a good job negotiating with this verse or not. That's beyond the powers of the biblical text to be able to do. And so there is a sincere sense in which we kind of do make it up. We kind of do make up this process of negotiation. That's on us. Now, hopefully we are interpreting in community, and so we can sort of consult with other people who have negotiated with this verse in the past and sort of ask, well, how did it work out well for you? What tips might you be able to give me as far as, what I'm getting out of this exchange? I've traded away a literal reading of this. What can I get back? What experience do you have with that? Hopefully we're reading in community, and so we have some wisdom from other people who have had to do this before. But still, it's not the Bible who is dictating how we ought to negotiate with this verse. Regardless, I think just about everybody can agree that some sort of negotiation is necessary here. I think once we recognize this, we can sort of take the next step then and recognize that with respect to virtually every verse in the entire Bible, and certainly with respect to the most morally and theologically significant ideas in the Bible, we are in a constant process of negotiation. We are doing this all the time. We are always trading away the ability to read certain verses in particular ways in exchange for the ability to read certain verses in other ways that fit better with verses that we care about and that fit better with our own personal experience. And I think if you can think about it in this way, it becomes a little bit less scary. Now, my job as a Bible scholar, and more importantly as a Bible teacher, is not so much to get you to negotiate with the Bible in a particular way, but rather to become more conscientious of the kinds of negotiations that you're already doing. Again, like I said, when we negotiate with the text unconsciously, it's all unconscious biases all the times. We are slaves to ideas that we've heard before and to doctrine that we've sort of just picked up incidentally along the way. The goal is to push people to become more conscientious interpreters of the text so that they recognize when they're negotiating with the Bible and they can make informed interpretive choices about the way that they're negotiating with the Bible. Ideally, this is an empowering thing to do because now you get to be in charge of this interpretive/negotiating process. And that's a big part of what I try and do here, both here on TikTok and in the classroom. I try and put this power into people's hands. So let me know in the comments below if this helps you think through the issue or if you find it useful in having conversations with your partner. If you have any more questions, you can drop them down there also.